Hi everyone, welcome to our second project of Unit 3. You're going to be drawing today a still life of some fruits or vegetables. I am assuming that's something you probably have already at your house, so you shouldn't need to go out and buy anything special, just use what you already have. Do at least 3 objects, so no more, or no less than 3, no fewer than 3. But you can put in more things if you want. I have 3 objects here. I have a tomato, a cucumber, and a squash that I just took from my garden. And I am going to make it in a horizontal composition. So I'm working with the paper going this way. So that's something that you want to think about is, do you want your composition to be horizontal or vertical? And I'm going to very lightly sketch it in. I usually sketch in with my HB pencil. But right now I'm going to try to sketch it with my 2H pencil and just keep it very light. So the same as when I start the other things, I just sort of block in generally where I think things will be. Some nice shadows. I put a light up above it, which is interesting. I don't know if I ever had the light source before coming from above. So simple as that, here is my general idea of my composition. So I didn't want to put it right in the middle of my page. I wanted to make it down sort of slightly lower, about 1/3 down. So I'm going to have, I didn't want to center it. I didn't think that would be that interesting. So I could see my objects, and now what I can do is, just as we always do, I could check my proportions by checking some lines. So if I run a horizontal line starting right here, which is the top of my tomato, and if I go all the way across, I actually see that the top of the tomato doesn't touch anything else. So the top of the squash here is just a little bit below the top of the tomato. And if I go to my next point, which is the top of this, which is a funny shaped cucumber that I just got, see where that's running through the squash, right about there. It's a little bit harder to find points on these because all of these objects are so round and so organic. I chose these 3 pieces of fruit because that's what I had. But if I were selecting this for a still life, if I were going to the grocery store and buying things just for the purpose of putting them in a still life, I would have gotten something that's a little taller, like maybe an acorn squash or a pumpkin, or something that would maybe come up to here in the height, so that I could have a little bit more of a height variation. I don't really like that these objects are all about the same height. One thing that I do like is that they do vary in value, so that's going to be fun to work with. So I'm pretty sure that everything's in the right place. One of the things that's fun about doing things like fruit and even landscapes and trees is that you can get it a little bit wrong and it's kind of hard to tell. Like, so if I get a glass or something that's mechanically made or man-made, if you make something like that wrong, everybody's gonna know. But if you draw your cucumber a little bit wrong, most people will probably accept it as long as it looks somewhat like a believable cucumber. I put the light above these objects, which I don't usually do. It's an interesting way to have the light source. I just liked it. I tried it a couple of ways. I tried putting a light at the side, and I tried putting a light at the other side. And at the end of it, after I tried all of them, I just sort of liked the light from above the best. I also did sort of a bad compositional thing. But I'm just going to work with it here, and I'm going to see if I can make it work where I have the edge of this squash is touching the shadow of the cucumber. And what my idea was in the composition was that I wanted to have my 3 objects and I wanted to have a little bit of variation. So I wanted to have 2 together. So I have my cucumber and my tomato together, and I wanted to set the squash apart as if it were on its own. And because it sort of just barely touches that little shadow, it doesn't really look like it's on its own. So I could do a couple of things here. I could either move the squash, Or I could just kind of give a little space between the shadow so that it's not like kissing, and I'll see if it works. And if it doesn't, I could just move it, or I could just live with my mistake and go on with my life. Because the light's from above, I've got a lot of really nice darks. I think this is going to be mostly a value drawing. Sort of like with the face, there's not a lot of hard edges in these vegetables. So you're going to be making a drawing that's really relying on tone to communicate the sense of volume and form. So I'm pretty happy with that proportionally. I think that looks like where everything is, and now I can start working on my values. So I'm going to switch pencils. I'll go to something that's a little bit darker. Some shadows, when you look at shadows, some shadows have a soft edge and some have a hard edge, and it's important to capture that variation. I also want to distinguish that this is the edge of the actual fruit versus the shadow. It gets very ambiguous in here, and it will happen sometimes that you have what we call lost edges, which is an edge that you intellectually, psychologically, you know is there, but you can't actually see it. And you don't want to draw it. If you can't see it, try to not include it. Just include what you can see. You should plan to spend a long time on this drawing. So it's up to you if you want to, if you have somewhere in your home where you can keep the still life set up and nobody will touch it for a little while, you could work on it over a couple different periods of time. So set aside a half an hour each day to work on it. Or if you have to, or if you prefer to, you could just do it all at once. But this one, plan on spending a very long time on this one, maybe even longer than the portrait, and try to make it really accurate and try to make it your best drawing of the term yet. And then I have this tomato. I'm trying to put in the darkest darks first. And that's going to help me see the whole thing. And I have some very dark darks on this tomato. So I'm going to look at what pencil I'm using. I'm using an HB. I'm going to go actually to a 6B. This is nearly black. Before I started drawing, I made sure that I sharpened all of my pencils very well. And I'm happy that I did, because now I don't have to stop what I'm doing to sharpen a pencil. Like I did with the portrait, I could probably make a true black by just pressing down really hard with this 6B pencil, but I'm not going to. I'm going to slowly build up the tone by pressing just medium average, and I'll make a couple passes over it if that's what I have to do. And I'm still going to go over my tomato again because I want it to be very, very dark. The reason that I want it to be dark is because I really want it to go behind that cucumber. And the other thing that's going to be equally dark as the tomato is the underside of this cucumber. That has to be very, very dark. For the most part, anytime you have something, the place where it touches the table, you know, is going to be pretty dark. I do have a highlight on the top of the cucumber that I'm going to try very hard to keep white. I could erase it out after, but if I could help it, I'd rather not do that. So because I'm putting my first pass at shading on the cucumber, I don't want to do my first one with the 6B. That seems a little risky. So I'm going to go back to the HB. Got a bit of a highlight here that I want to keep. And then I have a couple of these nice sort of striations that the cucumbers get that I want to have. That might help me know that it's a cucumber, because it's obviously, it's not going to be green. There's I think because it's like a misshapen cucumber, even with the lines, it's going to look like one of those gourds that gets stripes on it. So a lot of the cucumber is pretty dark, but it's, for the most part, not quite as dark as the tomato. It might be in here, so from this area to this area, I think it's about equal to the tomato in value. While I'm doing this, while I'm shading, in my mind, I'm imagining the shape of it as if my pencil were following the shape of the actual fruit. And that helps it look right, because that helps you have your marks going in a way that's sort of contouring it. This is a very defined edge, the edge of the cucumber. It's very light, but it's not, I have it looking sort of hairy and ambiguous, and I don't want that in my drawing, because there's so few hard edges in the whole composition that the ones that are there, I really do want to get them right. So I'm going to get rid of all that sketchy stuff around it to make it look more like a solid form. Now that I got my cucumber closer, I actually think this is darker, but now my tomato looks too light. So now I have to go back into the tomato. It's important in drawing to always be thinking about the relativity and how things relate to other things, especially, well, I was going to say especially in value, but proportion is all about relativity as well. So not especially in anything, in the whole drawing really is relativity. There is a clean edge also on the edge of this cucumber to the tomato. So I'm going to draw that in now. And I'm going to include some of those little bumps, you know, that are in cucumbers that give them their fun shape. And now I've pretty much established how dark this tomato has to be. So I need to work until this looks like not a line, because it's not a line, but like a solid blended value. One thing you want to be very careful of when you're working with tone like this is not to rest your hand on the paper. So I really only have the tip of my pencil in contact with the paper. If that's really hard for you, you could do something like put a folded up piece of paper between your hand and the paper. So if I can't help myself, if I need to rest my hand on the page like this, I'll just do this to keep something in between, because otherwise your hand is just going to smudge the graphite all over the paper, and you're going to end up with a drawing that looks really messy and a hand that looks really messy. But I feel like it's easiest just to not let your hand contact anything but the page, or anything at all. Just have your pencil touch the page. So that's looking okay. Now I need to make these shadows as dark as they are. Now the shadows, unlike the fruit itself, doesn't have this part of the shadow has a soft edge. We've got a harder edge down here. So I know that I want to make this whole area that I just sort of outlined pretty dark, especially when I get close to the cucumber itself. So the darkest is actually going to be... So this right here is going to be almost black. There's a tiny, I'm going to try to get it in if I can, just because it's fun, but there's a tiny highlight right there where I'm seeing through to behind the cucumber. I don't know if you could even tell that's what that is. I like to make my shading look like a massive tone. So I try to vary which direction the pencil moves in, so I kind of crisscross back and forth so that it doesn't look too much like it's going in one direction, so that it just looks like even. Something that I want to communicate that I haven't been able to yet is that this is really, it's not as dark as this, but it almost is. So it needs to be very close. And you want to look for that sort of range even within your darks or even within your lights. You want to try to find range if you can. So I'm going to move away from my 6B for a minute. I'm going to try an HB to get the ends of the shadow. The center of the shadow is really dark. The edges of it are dark too, but they have a softer edge. So and then I sort of neglected to finish the top of this tomato and even a little bit of the cucumber. So the edge is pretty bright, but it builds up to that. It's not like that right away. And in fact, by the time I get down to this edge of it, you really only see that bright edge, just sort of, just a little bit like that. So now I want to work on this tomato a little bit. The edge of the tomato, even where the highlight is not as bright as the cucumber. So the tomato, it's a really dark tomato. So even the light part of it is not as light. I do have one highlight right there that I'm going to try to preserve. Maybe a little one there. And everything else I'm going to... And then the same thing as my cucumber, I know that that edge of the tomato is not soft. So a lot of the time I don't care about my sketchy blocking in lines, but this time I am going to get rid of them so that that will look like a crisp edge there. All right, so now I just have to do my squash. I have to do the shading of the squash, and then hopefully when I do that, the whole thing is going to look like it all makes sense together. I did something that I really don't like to do here, which is to do something without even really getting into it over here. I like to try to work over the whole thing evenly, and it just didn't feel like the right thing to do this time. So there are a lot of things like that. There are a lot of little rules that you can make and then ignore them. But I usually do work over the whole page and don't go from, one area without addressing the other. So let's go. I'm going to sharpen my HB again. That's been getting a lot of use. Now I'm going to, what am I going to shade first? I think I'm going to shade the squash first, and then I'll do the shadow after. The shadow is a lot more subtle, and I think it's going to be a little bit difficult. So I'm going to start with the squash. The squash looks pretty manageable. I put the shadow in the wrong place. I don't know why I did that. I see that it's actually down here. But the squash looks like it's pretty much just one solid tone. So just as with my cucumber, I have a very dark area right where the squash and the table meet. You usually have that whenever something comes in contact with a table. It's good. It helps it make it look like it's sitting on the table and not floating. I think I drew this incorrectly. So I need to make this come down a bit more, and then it also gets very dark because this is also touching the table. My shadow comes to about here. And then I do have a part where I could see right through. There's not much of a shadow there, areas, but it's very light, so I'm gonna do it later. So now I'm gonna do the same thing that I did with the squash, just with the shadow. I'm just gonna try to put an even mid-tone on the whole thing. Right now I feel like I'm rushing and I wanna get to the end of it. So if you find yourself feeling like that and you are able to leave the still life and come back at another time, that would probably mean that's a good time to do that. So if you feel as I do right now, that you're just sort of rushing through, walk away, come back in a couple hours, or even the next day. I don't know why this stem there's no shadow on the table from it. It seems like there would be. That's so strange. I like finding things like that. I like finding things that seem to not really make sense. And when you notice them, it means that you're really looking. I'm going to work on getting the edge of this squash. I think that's going to be much better. So you might notice I'm spending as much, if not more, time on the shadows than I am on the fruit. They're just as important, and in a lot of ways they're a little bit harder to get right. And now all I really need is to get this big gourd right. So I know that this is extremely dark, this whole thing. And I think that once I made that as dark as it is, I have to start making the squash darker. But I have some of those fun little bumpy things that are on a squash around here that I want to get in, just so that you know that it's a squash. Okay, so I guess that's pretty good. Let me stand back. One of the reasons I don't like sitting down and drawing is that I'm never able to stand back and really see my drawing. Looks like that took me 1 hour and 13 minutes total, so you could break that up into a couple different sessions. I would recommend that, actually. But that's your still life of 3 fruits. All right, enjoy.